All right. Welcome back to the Black Muse Podcast. I am your host, Jason Muse. We are back. We are live. We are keeping it pushing. As I've explained before in previous episodes, we have two different types of shows. One is the current events one, where we talk about multiple different kind of current events topics. And we do kind of like a little Costco sample of our opinions on these things. And then the other one is more of a deep dive episode where we spend the entire episode talking about one topic and going as deep as possible and exploring all of the nuances and things like that. So today is going to be a deep dive episode. And the topic of discussion for today is going to be Daily Wire, and in particular, Matt Walsh's documentary that came out not too long ago called What is a Woman? It has been the talk of the town, particularly amongst right-leaning conservative circles. It's a documentary that touches on hot-button controversial issues surrounding trans rights, surrounding the medical controversies about what is the best form of medical care for trans youth. It explores even some philosophical ideas around how definitions ought to work and what the political motivations for the changing of definitions might be, or the establishing of definitions in the first place might be, and how that relates to power. All of these things and more are the kinds of things that we're going to be discussing. Whether or not the documentary itself consists of mere right-wing, transphobic right-wing propaganda, or if there's something a little bit more substantive, or at least partially valid about some of the contents of it. So I'm actually excited to talk about this because I've been meaning to talk about this for a while, and I can definitely see some validity on both sides. I guess that's what makes me a moderate, but I want to make sure that I introduce this properly. And so with that, I want to show the trailer for What is a Woman by the Daily Wire.
What is a woman? Can you tell me that? Well, you're at the Women's March. You must have some idea. Please, if one person could tell me what a woman is.
You are not here for women. We ask you to leave.
What is that?
I'm a husband. I'm a father of 4. I host a talk show. I give speeches. I write books. I like to make sense of things.
A woman is not anything in particular.
There is not one particular thing.
It could be many things to many people.
Some women have penises, right? Some men have vaginas.
I like scented candles, and I've watched Sex and the City.
Yeah,
How do I know if I'm a woman?
that's a great question.
You're not a scientist. You're not a gender studies major.
No,
How do you know that you're a man?
I guess because I got a dick.
Can a man become a woman?
I'm not a woman, so I can't really answer that.
Women only know what women are.
Are you a cat?
No.
Can you tell me what a cat is? Do you want to tell us what a woman is?
I'm a biological woman that medically transitioned to appear like a male. I will never be a man.
And so they go on the internet and they're told that all of their problems will be solved if they become a man.
So you worry that there could be a sort of social contagion element of this?
A teeny tiny bit, maybe.
It got me at 42. Your child doesn't have a chance.
And you're affirming it with hormones that have never been used in this way.
Puberty blockers, which are completely reversible.
Completely reversible.
One of the drugs used is Lupron, right? Which has actually been used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
You know what? I'm not sure that we should continue with this interview.
So you don't want to talk about the drugs that you give to kids, or?
How can they be removing the healthy breasts of 15-year-old girls?
There are masculine girls. There are feminine boys. What are we gonna do about that? Carve them up?
How can this whole thing be happening, Matt?
I wanted us to have a safe place to be able to talk about this.
Part of me wants to ask why you care so much.
I care about the truth. I care about children. I care about the women who are having their opportunities stolen from them.
Is it transphobic to tell the truth?
The interview's over. Let's turn off the cameras.
Excuse me,
They're fair question. I just wanted to know, what is a woman?
and you're not gonna find out.
Based on what I'm saying, would you ever want to move to America?
They say no, never.
I hope you enjoyed it a little bit.
We'll see when it comes out.
I want to actually bring on my guest for today. He's been waiting patiently. His name is Ibrahima. And so without further ado, let's welcome our guest for today, Ibrahima, the man, the legend. How are you doing this morning?
How's that?
All right, you're back. We're good. Let's start that over. Ibrahima, the man, the legend. How you doing today, man?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm doing quite well, alhamdulillah. That was the formal Muslim greeting. May peace, God's mercy, and His blessings be upon you. Just for translation here. I'm doing quite well. I'm glad to be back here, my man. How are you?
I'm good. I'm gonna say the same corny joke I said last time, which is, as long as you're not talking about my mama in another language, we're good. We're good. But no, I'm glad to have you on the show. We've been putting this off for a while. We're finally gonna get down to the nitty gritty. Were you able to see the trailer?
I was, yeah. I saw it. I saw the documentary. So
we both saw the documentary, but I meant just like during the show, were you able to kind of see it again?
Yeah.
When you were watching the trailer, so for me, I was kind of reliving having seen it. I think I've seen it 4 times now in preparation for the show mostly, but I was kind of reliving certain parts that were highlighted. Was it like that for you?
Definitely. Certainly the cringeworthy parts definitely came back up.
Okay.
So we're going on this journey. Boys can be girls, girls can be boys, men can be women, women can be men. It makes me wonder, what is a woman?
What is a woman? A woman is someone who claims that as their identity. It could be many things to many people.
Yeah. So let's get into it. So the documentary is titled "What is a Woman?" and part of what I think is being conveyed as a part of the message, and I think the message is actually layered, is that such a question used to be regarded, that is the question of what a woman is, definitionally, used to be regarded as something very, very simple, like asking what 1 + 1 is, or asking what letter comes after the letter A in the alphabet. Something very simple. We don't really question it. Or if you wanted to define other simple things like what a cat is or what a dog is. This is the stuff of grade school. This is the kinds of things that we teach first graders. But yet it seems lately in our politics, particularly when it comes to gender ideology and the mainstreaming of gender ideology as it relates to trans folk, that question is not so easy to answer. And I think that part of the reason, well, I want to invite you to speculate. What do you think the reason could be for people like Matt Walsh and those in the Daily Wire to hone in on this question of what a woman is definitionally, as a way to kind of, in some sense, push back politically against a lot of the tenets of gender ideology?
I mean, it seems to me that we're sort of shifting the definition like drastically in a very short period of time, and most people have noticed this. This wasn't something that was part of the mainstream discourse probably until, I would say, I mean, I caught on to it early in like 2016, but most people didn't really hear about terms like non-binary or gender fluid and things like that till 2020. This is when it really became a mainstream household idea. But before the 90s, it wasn't even part of the academic discourse. Queer theory kind of came around in the late 90s or so, coming out of the radical feminist, school of thought. And what we're seeing today is a real push through not only political means, but in other, even non-political institutions to, I can't even, for lack of a better word, to, coerce essentially the use of specific language in a specific context. And I think that's a pressure that's being felt by everyone, even if they're not willing to admit it. Guys like Matt Walsh are willing to, push back on it and admit that there is a social pressure to change the way we define these words.
Well, I do think that there's definitely social pressure being laid bare, but in the same way that social pressure is laid bare anytime you advocate politically for this or that group of people. So we can take the civil rights movement. There was social pressure being laid bare in order to gain civil rights, like voting rights, for example, for Black people. in order to overturn Jim Crow laws in the South, etc. That's actually fairly normal, and I think that the people who are the most ardent supporters or advocators of the, I guess, changing of definitions, is, as you call it, I think that they think of themselves as doing something akin or analogous to what those members of the civil rights movement were doing. But instead of doing it on behalf of Black people specifically, they're doing it on behalf of people who don't quite fit nicely into what they call the gender binary. What do you think about that? Like in terms of like how these people think of what they're doing?
So I think the key difference here is that there are, for example, when we're talking about race, there are, biological analogs, not necessarily in differences, but in like phenotype. Like I can physically tell that you're Black, and it doesn't really define who you are, other than the fact that your skin is a certain color. So for me to say that you are a certain way just because of your skin color in itself is an illogical conclusion. Like, that's not enough information to determine that about a person. And to make laws that follow that line of thought is obviously erroneous, illogical, and it violates human beings' basic rights. But what we're having here is more so a compelling of the use of language in order to change the social perception of a really a biological difference. When we're talking about the gender binary, um, in the scientific discourse, we have a gender binary because of the binary nature of our sexual organs and our sexual cells. Even if you are an intersex person, you do still fall within that binary. You either produce one gamete or another. There's no in between. And that actually sort of before we even had the scientific discourse, these typical sexual organs and the resulting physical limitations or advantages of weight or whatever they may be in a man or a woman were just that. These were considered to be innate, but we didn't have the language to describe the biological discourse in itself. But back to the gender theory version of this, and the reason why I think it's not like the civil rights movement at all is that they're using essentially a faith claim. It's a set of beliefs. It's not necessarily based on any sort of objective reality, but rather a belief. It's combining a couple different ideologies, but it's a belief that language in itself is used as a power structure. And therefore, the only reason why we view these people as, unfitting to be in one gender or the other, or we're pigeonholing someone in a gender, is because of social expectations that we're pushing on a certain type of person. And I think that in itself would require a ton of evidence in order for me to, take that on. But it doesn't seem like it's really the concern as much as it is to compel speech in order to change perceptions.
Okay, well, and let's pick that apart, and I'm gonna play devil's advocate because I think that there are a lot of things that you said that could be perceived as controversial, or that one could give pushback against if they're coming from this other perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So in the first place, I think that we would do well to acknowledge that there are a lot of parallels between facets of our racial identities and facets of our gender identities. It's not obvious that my skin color is any less biological than the relevant parts of my anatomy that are associated with my biological sex, or indeed my gender. The fact that I have a lot of melanin in my skin is biological. It is a product of biology, every bit as much as the fact that I have other parts of my anatomy are, number one. But number two, there does seem to be a kind of interaction between the kind of hardline biological facets of ourselves on the one hand, and the social designators that we take these biological factors to indicate about us in social and political contexts on the other. I.e., there's facets of our identities that are indeed socially constructed. This applies to race every bit as much as it applies to gender. It doesn't mean that everything about us is made up. But there's nothing, I think, about the fact that I have certain facets of my male anatomy that, for instance, associates me with things that are stereotypically masculine necessarily. Indeed, to take a silly case, it associates me with the color blue. That's a color that's associated with boys or males for some reason. But there's nothing natural in the order of the universe that makes that the case. That actually is a function, a fairly arbitrary one, but a function nonetheless of the ways in which we've made associations in social contexts, and indeed that doesn't even hold in every culture. So that might be a kind of easy example of that kind of thing. And if we start to examine this and maybe count several more examples of these kinds of socially constructed associations between facets of our anatomy and, let's say, masculinity, or facets of our anatomy and, say, femininity, etc., I think we would start to find out pretty quickly that a lot of the things that we have come to think of as inextricably linked to our anatomy in terms of our biological sex isn't really inextricably linked at all. And I think that there's at least a part of this discourse on gender ideology is picking apart those kinds of things and trying to point out the ways in which those associations that we hold really fast to have negative impacts for certain people who don't naturally fall into those categories very nicely. You may have very, very masculine women. You may have very, very effeminate men. You may have men or women who their inner sense of themselves is more in alignment with what we might call the opposite sex. Or if that's too politically loaded, their gender identity doesn't quite fit nicely into the kind of binary paradigm. I think that's probably the best way to steel man that position, at least at first. Do you have any objections to that?
I would slightly push back on the arbitrary nature of the color associations. I think there is a biological component in that, well, at least an evolutionary component in that, as far as like what we associate certain behaviors or certain statuses, or as far as the status example, just to clarify a little bit. There's things like purple being associated with royalty, but that's like a historical origin. Being like a color that's really hard to get, and was really only able to be worn by people who had access to a very rare sea mollusk that produced that dye. But when we're talking about things like association between red and blue, like with boys and girls,
pink and blue.
Yeah, but pink, and I misspoke. I meant pink, but red is also something. It's a shade of that pink, and it does kind of associate with like warmer colors versus colder colors, colors that if made a little darker, like red, for example, red to pink. That's like a fleshy, vulnerable color, rather than a colder color. Like blue. If it's made to be darker, it's nowhere near the ability to be perceived as like as a softer, warmer color. It's more of a colder, darker hue. Like as far as like association between the types of behaviors that you would see typically in one sex or the other. It does seem as if it's completely arbitrary at this point, because there's no real instinctual sort of draw towards one or the other, but there is a slightly pull towards that. Things like fruits, for example, have a reddish color and do have a certain association that women are drawn to, for example. You understand what I mean?
Kind of. I mean, it seems like to steelman you a little bit. It seems like you're trying to push back against the part of the claim where I said it was arbitrary, and I think you're trying to cash that out in terms of evolutionary explanations for how the associations came to be the way that they are. But I don't know how helpful that's going to be, because I think the main point that I was trying to make was that there's nothing about the biology of the anatomy of males versus females that necessitates the association. And so that connection, in virtue of that, seems arbitrary. because it didn't have to be that way, presumably, because there's nothing naturally necessitating the connection. That's what I was trying to articulate.
I mean, and you see this in art as well, in the art world, where you see association with color being used to tell stories in an art piece. Like you see a lot of like feminist art, depicting, for example, feminine sexual organs, and usually you'll see the colors associated with that not to be sort of like blue or another colder color, as much as it is like fleshier looking colors. You understand what I mean?
Yeah. I'm not
This is
saying that
something that
there's
we naturally sort of gravitate towards, and I think the origin of it is evolutionary. And those associations are not just. I think they predate the social. What's it called? Well, by a lot actually, the social administration of those colors to one or the other. It's kind of like a derivation of it. But that wasn't my main point. I just wanted to touch on that really quickly. But as far as the gender spectrum, as far as like the behaviors that are expected out of someone within a certain gender structure, uh, I think we often leave out the part in which there are such things as ideals. As far as like what we consider to be the best mix of behaviors within a certain structure, depending on what your attributes are. So, given an example, like with men and women, there are like legitimate biological differences that kind of define what you can be best at, as far as, uh, whether it be physical prowess or whether it be sort of interest or time that you can pour into a certain, uh, what's it called, into a certain endeavor. And also, there is a biological clock component when it comes to women and their drive to have children. This is something that I don't think we can ignore, because statistically about 90% of women, by the time they're in their 40s, have children. Child rearing and being carrying a child is actually a very time consuming endeavor. It is something that we see in labor statistics. Having children is one of the biggest it's one of the biggest factors in predicting a woman's income over time, especially if they're single or they don't have a partner in their life. It does cause like actual disruptions in your life, in your career, which would kind of warrant the specialization of one gender role within a partnership, which does not have to go through the burden of carrying a child, being vulnerable, the pain, and the time consuming nature of rearing a child, especially in the early years. So to say that you are going to have children, there are certain attributes that would make you best at what's it called, at rearing children. Just as if you are going to be the partner which is not rearing children, there are certain attributes that make you more valuable than someone else if you were to choose, because we do discriminate. We choose who our partners are, and we choose them based on certain attributes. So to have an ideal to measure from, I think in itself is something that's innate to any endeavor or anything that we even look at. We judge even inanimate objects in that way. Like there are ideals that we reach towards. There are things that are that don't function quite as well. So to have an idea of like what's the pinnacle of a man, like what are the mixes of attributes and attitudes and capabilities that make a man very valuable. It's like if you fall really far away from it to the point where you feel like you can compete better in the other hierarchy, it doesn't make you less of a man necessarily.
Okay, so you've said a lot, and I want to
Yeah,
be
sorry,
a little bit more discursive. No, it's fine. I
Okay.
want you to get it out because I want to flush out kind of where you're starting, but I want to introduce this as politely as possible. I'm gonna start being a little bit more discursive and pushing back on specific things line by line, only because I want there to be a little bit more back and forth. A lot of the things that you're saying, I understand and they resonate with me, but a lot of things that you're saying, even I'm more moderate. I'm not really that gung ho in favor of a lot of the gender ideology stuff, but I do hear where they're coming from, and I do feel that for the purpose of this discussion, to make it more expansive and more, I guess, useful, that I kind of have to take on that side a little more and stuff. So I want to start with this. A lot of the things that you actually are describing in full detail in terms of the idealized man, let's say, or male, and the idealized woman or female, and I think you mean it and understood in the kind of traditional binary paradigm. I'm only specifying that not to downplay it, but to emphasize it because for the point I'm about to make. A lot of the things that you're talking about are still socially constructed, and they have the same kind of arbitrariness that I was trying to say before. And so I anticipate that to whatever extent you were pushing back on the arbitrariness before, that a lot of those things would apply to some of the things that we're now discussing. But like the set of attributes that comprises the ideal man or the ideal male actually varies by society. It's not even uniform across cultures. I think that's one way of getting real quick at one fact, which is that a lot of that stuff is socially constructed, and we can tell because it's contingent upon what the paradigms or dominant ideas in a society or given culture even are. If you travel to certain places of the globe, certain attributes that are associated with maleness would be more emphasized there than other places. There may be certain things that we may hear in the West associate more with females that in other places are actually associated with males. So you have so one example off the top of my head, and forgive my ignorance because I know very little. I understand this at a basic level. Is I believe it's called the kilt that are worn by what culture is that? Oh my god,
Scottish.
I'm blanking. Yeah, the Scottish culture, and that's something that resembles a skirt in the West. Well, I guess Scotland kind of consists of the West, but here in the United States in particular, that people who don't understand the cultural relevance of that may associate that with the skirt because it looks very similar. Skirts are associated generally with women. It's a form of dress that is associated with femininity for various different reasons. But that is actually a very masculine thing to wear. It has a lot of cultural salience that if you're not a part of that culture and you don't learn about it, it might go over your head. That might be an example of that illustrates that even the things that are traditionally or generally associated with either sex or either end of the gender spectrum, if you want to put it that way, that's not even uniform. And you can do that with a lot of different aspects or things that are associated with men and women. All of that to say that there are going to be people, presumably in any given culture, in any given cultural context, who may be in some sense, I want to use these terms carefully because I don't want to be pejorative. They in some sense maybe deviate from the expectations and the social pressures that kind of keep these expectations in line, or in some sense perpetuate them. It makes sense why a person or why several people who don't quite fit these paradigms through no fault of their own would perceive those as in some sense oppressive, because it restrains the ways with which they can express themselves, the ways with which they can present themselves in public places without being bullied, without being discriminated against, etc. I think that is the core of what drives the non-binary and trans activists to the extent that they're not being toxic. Because I have a lot to say about the toxicity with which they
yeah.
So I want you to but before we go there, because we're going to get into it, and we're going to get into the documentary specifically, but I want to kind of start us with that, because I do think that's a fair way to steel man the other side.
I think so as well, but I have two things to say about that. I think one, first of all, the difference is not in kind, but in degree. And two, even within a specific culture, those expectations are not uniform.
Right.
Do you understand what I mean by this?
Yeah, I do. We'll start with the first one though, because I don't know that I understand the first point you made. What do you mean by
when we're talking about differences as far as the expectations of males within a culture across the world, there are what's it called, very common themes. There are themes that we see reoccurring over and over and over and over again, and the degree to which each one of those themes is emphasized within a culture varies in degree rather than in kind. There are no cultures, like at least large cultures that have existed for a long time, where men are are expected to handle child rearing. I'm sure there are some modern examples that have been made possible through the advent of non-physical work, which it hasn't really been that long since we've been able to take advantage of like fuel sources to use power that's beyond what your body can produce in a single day.
What do you mean? But sorry, I want to clarify something. What do you mean men are not expected? So like child rearing is a vague term.
Okay, so
a lot of
essentially,
different things.
yeah. So what I mean by that is essentially being the primary caregiver for an infant and a child up until to the point where they can sort of be relatively independent.
So single fathers don't exist?
They do, but that is sort of that is not the ideal sort of situation we're looking for, and also it's a very rare case.
I think it
it's not
is
that
typically rare because I think it's
but
rare.
if we're talking
to your
about
point.
couples, which I mean, at this point now, like half of kids in this country are raised by a single parent.
Well, I think one of the reasons I think it's rare is because there are a lot of typically. So first of all, and it may be controversial to say this, but I'm trying to be fair to both sides, and this is going to be awkward. Human males cannot give birth to children, right? Anybody who does not have the relevant anatomy necessary or required to give birth, a uterus, ovaries, all of that stuff, a womb, etc. They cannot give birth in virtue of that. I think that even the most staunchest radical trans activist types have to admit that fact of biology, right? That's what I mean when I say human males can't give birth. And it's not because of some kind of biological condition or something. It's not in virtue of that. It's in virtue of the fact that their anatomy has never been the relevant anatomy that human males have cannot produce children. They can produce them in the form of providing the seed or sperm cells,
the
but
male
not
gamete.
but yeah, exactly. But they can't produce them in their bodies as human females can. Now, the fact that I had to be very careful about that insofar as I'm trying to accommodate the kinds of language that people who are proponents of the gender ideology we mean to discuss kind of use is kind of part of what I mean to talk about and kind of part of what ruffles my feathers. But I said that to say that one of the reasons I think it's rare for men to be the primary caregivers is because actually their biology, and by men here, I'm using it in the more traditional binary term, talking about human males. Their biology actually isn't even sufficient to care for them in terms of like men typically don't produce the breast milk. I know that there are certain circumstances in which males can produce milk, but it's typically human females, and it's typically in virtue of the fact that they were just pregnant that it triggers certain causal mechanisms that actually make their breasts enlarge and start producing. They start lactating and stuff like that. That's like a biological function. Men, that doesn't happen in men just because I don't know women around them are pregnant. Like that's not typically how it happens. And again, I'm using men as to refer to human male temporarily. We'll go back to the different ways in which the term man and woman are used in this context, in this discourse. So I think that's part of one of the things that contributes to it. But like we could easily imagine a society in which men, beyond the practicalities of not being able to produce breast milk and things like that, still were heavily involved in child rearing. That's not impossible. And the last point I want to arrive at is like child rearing, actually men play a vital role in child rearing generally, although I don't know that they play a vital role in the early stages of it when it comes to like nursing and things like that, to be fair. And so like when you say that we don't have any cultures where men are responsible for child rearing, I feel like that's not quite accurate. But I think what you're talking about are primarily things like that are associated with like nursing, like breastfeeding, and and all the other stereotypical things that we do associate in the West with women and with mothers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to clarify as well that I'm talking about within a relationship, in which a couple produces a child. We don't have. I don't think that there are really any cultures out there where the man is the primary caregiver, and I think that's not an arbitrary thing because of something that I mentioned earlier, being that pregnancy is something that usually interrupts careers. And when you're looking at especially careers that are highly technical, usually any interruption will actually cause you to fall behind, and you will fall behind not only in your know-how but in your income capacity, as well as other types of work where I'm sure employers are more likely to what's it called, at least employers look at gaps in employment and things like that, and a man who doesn't have to have a gap in employment is more marketable in the job market than he would be if he had several ones. And this is
Or
why
women who don't have children,
or women who don't have children. And actually we see the same phenomenon actually play itself out in income statistics. If you look at the Bureau of Labor statistics or census data, the highest earning class of people in the country, and I'm sure it's like this around the world, are men who are married, followed by women who have never married, who have never had children, followed by men who have never married, had never had children, and at the bottom of the totem pole, these are the people who make up most of part-time jobs, who have the least labor participation and the lowest income, are women who have children but have never married or don't have a partner. It's like these are things that we see shake out in real world application. It's like, and I don't think that's arbitrary at all. It's really a function of the reality that comes along with the lifestyle choices.
And if arbitrary is the term that's going to trip us up, we can maybe use a different term. But it is a facet of the ways in which we have organized our society, at least partially. That is something that contributes to that. We do not have to organize our society in such a way where competition is the main determining or one of the biggest determining factors for where your lot in life is going to be in terms of your earning potential and whatnot. We could imagine a society that was organized in such a way that actually was very, very accommodating to pregnant women, such that even though they had to have maternity leave and various things like that, they could still continue their career trajectories and society would function just fine. And in fact, there's been strong advocacy and various pushes in corporate America and elsewhere to actually reorganize the structures of our society and the structures with which we organize our companies and corporations and things like that, to allow for that. To allow for women to go on maternity leave and even men to go on maternity leave and then come back and their jobs waiting for them, for example. And I think we're starting to see that more now, more than we've ever seen it before, even though the trends that you just described, I think, are generally still true. And so to me, that signals the kind of thing I was getting at before, which is the social construct thing is a very contingent thing. It depends on how we organize our society. And there doesn't seem to be any necessity to the ways with which things are now. And if that's true, then I think that those who have the kind of critique of the gender binary that they have some bit of a point in that part of what they're recognizing is we don't have to structure our society in the way that we do, right? We can structure our society in a way that's more accommodating to people who don't quite fit into these boxes nicely. And indeed, I think that they would go further to say we have a moral obligation to do so because that's more inclusive, right? We have a moral obligation to organize a society in such a way where it doesn't discriminate against anybody, including those who are non-binary or those who are trans or those who don't quite fit into the gender binary paradigm quite nicely. Can you at least recognize the validity of that kind of argument?
I would say that argument hinges on the assumption that that moral conception is actually most beneficial, and I would actually have to see what the origins are of that moral conception and what are its actual axioms and whether or not those are even valid.
Well, I think that they would think of it as analogous to what I would argue, and I think you might agree, that we had a moral obligation to organize our society in such a way that didn't discriminate against Black people.
I mean, is it true that because as far as we go right now, there are a lot of people who claim that people are still actually. As a matter of fact, let me go at it this way. I don't think discrimination can be centrally planned. Like I don't think you have the ability to centrally plan whether or not people discriminate. And
Okay.
I don't think it's the same thing as the actual conception of
Well,
bigotry. Whether or not you hate someone doesn't necessarily dictate whether or not you'll what's it called, discriminate against them.
I don't know what centrally planned is supposed to mean the way
Well,
you
you're
used it.
talking about
but I'll push
organizing a
back and-
society.
Right, in general, but we don't centrally plan our society like that. Usually
But
our
how would you
society has a
organize?
bunch of different our society is actually layered. So our society, we have local municipalities, then we have state jurisdictions, and then we have federal jurisdictions. You know that, right? So we have a confluence of a lot of different organizational structures at different levels, and they actually interacted with each other in a lot of nuanced ways, and sometimes they're unpredictable. We don't centrally plan the structures of our society in that way. So you've introduced a concept that I wasn't even trying to evoke. I wasn't trying to make it seem as though that we when I say we organize our society, I don't mean that there's only one entity that does all the organization. That's not what I mean. The way we organize our
It
society
doesn't
is
have to be an
actually
entity. Just to clear up, not necessarily
okay.
just
But
an
what I mean
entity,
is
but
it's
a
not
singular
centrally
idea.
planned. Okay, but what I'm
But
saying
it
is it's
has
not
to come
centrally
off
planned in
a
the sense.
singular ideal, doesn't it?
No, not necessarily. So the way our society works, there are a lot of ideals that are popular and a lot of ideals that are widespread, but they're not uniform across the nation, right? You have certain pockets of our society, certain states, let's say, that are against abortion. You have certain states that are very much accommodating for abortion. That's just one example. I can give you a million more, right? So we don't have uniformity even of ideas in our society. We don't even have uniformity in terms of the structure of our society, right? We don't have the same laws, exactly the same laws that apply to every single facet of our society. There are certain laws that vary by degree or by the level of punishment, by what the status of them are considered. Like, for example, whether something counts as a felony versus a misdemeanor, that can, depending on what it is, that can vary from state to state, etc. So there's a lot of nuance there.
We have federal jurisdiction though, as far as like racial discrimination or protected class and things like that. That is a uniform.
But we
like,
didn't
attempt
always
to organize society.
But we didn't always. That actually is a product of the fact that what we started seeing, especially during the civil rights movement, was one of the main pushes of this in our society, is people were pushing back against the idea that states had the right to inculcate into their laws or instantiate into their laws forms of legal discrimination against certain people. That was a big part of what the civil rights movement was advocating against. And so there we felt that there was a need to federalize and actually add constitutional amendments to our Constitution to make it the case that nobody's going to be discriminated on the basis of immutable characteristics such as race, etc. Right? And I think that a lot of the gender non-binary people that we're tacitly referring to in this discussion, what they're seizing on is what they think of as something analogous to that, which is that in the same way that we have a moral obligation to organize our society in such a way that we don't discriminate against Black people, we don't discriminate against the disabled, we don't discriminate against old people, etc. We shouldn't discriminate against people who don't fit into the gender binary either. And so if you're going to question the morality of that, then it's not obvious how you can get away from questioning the morality of an analogous principle when it comes to in these other identities.
So are you referring to the 14th when you're talking about the amendments added? Are you talking about the 14th Amendment? Well, I mean that predates the civil rights movement.
No, true.
If we're talking about like the Civil Rights Act, for example.
Let me clarify. You're right. So those amendments do predate the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement added the Voting Rights Bill in 1965, right? But the civil rights movement was a part of a general abolition movement, and the abolition movement was part of what thrusted in the 13th, 14th, and I think 15th Amendments, right? So that was post Civil War. So I didn't say that explicitly, but I'm thinking that as a part of that tradition.
I'm getting you. I think things like the Civil Rights Act, for example, even went like beyond that to the point where they essentially legitimize the use of things like disparate impact, like like for example, when you see a disparity within an industry, industry, you can now sue on a federal level with the EEOC. I believe that's what it is. Equal opportunity. I forgot what the acronym is exactly. But you can sue just based on the fact that there is a disparity in racial makeup of in a certain company or in a certain industry or whatever it may be, without even actually having a harmed party. I think that's an overstep when it comes to legislation in that manner, and I think it actually makes an attempt to equalize the ground and actually central. I think that is also what I mean when I say centrally planning a society's you know beliefs and like a level of discrimination. And it's like when you make attempts to do that, it can backfire. There are second and third order consequences that come along with that. Like for example, what's a good one? Oh yeah, affirmative action, for example, where it's essentially there's an assumption that the disparity in itself comes from discrimination, which is something that I believe that you would have to actually prove logically in the first place to make that assumption. It's not something that you can just make. You can just assume. We have examples from other countries where that's not really the case. Um, but affirmative action in the workplace and affirmative action in schools have second order consequences that actually hurt some of the candidates that it's supposed to help. One example of that is, if you're looking at affirmative action colleges and you look at the graduation rates for affirmative action students and non-affirmative action students, and you compare the states that have removed those laws, like for example in California, and what you see is that protected class, once the affirmative action programs are removed, their graduation rates go up because they're actually starting to be matched with schools that are more appropriate for their level.
But can you just do me a favor, establish the relevance of it? Because we're getting into
we're going
race, but I want to go back to gender.
I just wanted to give an example as far as like what are the second and third order consequences of trying to apply laws in ways that are overreaching it for a specific goal. Because I think
how's that germane to the gender discussion?
Well, where you're talking about organizing a society in order to accommodate for certain lifestyle choices that are different from the typical. And what I'm trying to say is that it's not.
That's not quite how
I don't think. I'm sorry. What?
That's not quite how I put it. I'm saying organize a society in such a way where we don't discriminate against.
Yeah, but that's my entire point. Like that is an accommodation in order not to discriminate. But my point is that controlling how people discriminate is not something I think can be effectively done without causing other huge problems that may even be getting to a point of diminishing returns. Because if let me go back to an example that you gave earlier, as far as like pregnant women and the job waiting for them after they come back. The job may be waiting for them, but the field, the knowledge base, the market is not waiting for them. That employee is not, and especially if they choose, which is actually rarer than we actually usually discuss. People who have children, women who have children, generally tend to spend a lot more time worrying about their child, doing things for their child and with their child. That person is no longer completely dedicated as far as like the time spent on that work compared to someone who has a partner who specializes in child rearing while they're taking on the role of focusing on increasing their progress as far as their income capacity or their mastery of a certain skill. Like that's not something that you can just legislate away or what's it called, or introduce benefits at work to. That's not going to go away.
Yeah, you can. You can systematize all kind. You can have all kinds of incentives to organizations.
But you can give them more money,
like this.
But it's still
you can do all kinds of things. You can give them tax exemptions. You can force them by or mandated by law. I don't know how effective it would be. But there's all kinds of things that you can do, or you can advocate and change the cultural milieu around how it's, or you can advocate and change the cultural milieu around how it's viewed so that it's actually more grassroots in nature and not top down. There's a lot of different things you can do. in terms of
wait, hold on, because I'm talking about.
changing the mechanisms of society in such a way where it's more accommodating to women in
But
the situation such as you described.
how would you
But
change
also,
the
we're not even
mechanism of
just talking.
society in order to stop
Well, I
the
just gave you
progress of
several
a certain?
ways.
No, but I'm asking what's called the progress of a field technologically, or as
You don't have
far
to
as like
stop. You don't have to stop the progress of a certain field. So, for example,
but
like the
that
innovation
person's
can continue.
progression. Yeah, but that person's progression is not going to be the same as someone who didn't have who had an interrupted career. It's not going to be the same.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be in order for them to
But
still
if they're
be able
competing,
to have the hold on, let me finish. It doesn't have to in order for them to be able to still have their career and still make progress after however long it took them to step away, have their child, sharing some of the child rearing responsibilities, etc. Women do it all the time in America, actually, and it's becoming more common now than it ever has been. Some women would think that would argue that, particularly the feminists would argue that that's progress, but that there's more progress to be made because of the trends that you cited earlier, which is that women who have children overwhelmingly find their careers being interrupted in a fairly permanent sense, particularly in the most male dominated areas of the economy.
I mean, I don't disagree with that, but my opinion is that if you're going to hire people, you're gonna have to discriminate, and discrimination is not inherently a bad thing. Even choosing a sexual partner.
Well, insofar as
even choosing to have me as a guest, you had to choose and discriminate against certain people that you would never have on.
Everybody else said no. You were not my first choice. I'm kidding.
Oh, man.
No.
But
Okay,
but
I understand what you mean. But to me, that's equivocate on what we mean by discrimination. We mean it in the pejorative sense. We mean it in built into it when we're talking about it in political context. We're talking about unjust discrimination. Typically, discrimination based on arbitrary or immutable characteristics or arbitrary facts about you. If you're going to discriminate, like for example, if I wanted to select between two possible, I don't know, people that I want to date or whatever, I may choose the one who I find more attractive and then choose against the one who I find less attractive. You can describe that in terms of the denotative meaning of the word discrimination as a form of discrimination. I'm not denying that. That there is a use of that word that is consistent with that. But what we mean are such examples more akin to if I'm choosing between two candidates for a job and I choose the one that's white over the one that's black because built into my psychology or because I've internalized a bunch of social norms that favor the person with white skin over the person with black skin, despite the fact that doesn't have any obvious connection with their ability to do the job, right? Mm-hmm. That's the kind of discrimination that we are against. And what I think the non-binary crowd are talking about and the trans activist types are talking about is we have forms of discrimination based on gender identity in society that are akin to the second example and less akin to the first example. And that's why it's problematic, because the people who get screwed are the non-binary and trans people.
And I would. Well, okay. First of all, as far as like that type of discrimination specifically, there are costs that you have to pay for as a person who's discriminating against qualified talent, which is a rare thing. I think we can both agree on that. Qualified people who work very well and are interested in doing the best for your necessarily, they don't grow on trees. Anybody who's done any recruiting knows. So for you to use some sort of weird characteristic like that as far as judgment of employment, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Someone else is going to hire that person. At least your competitor.
Not necessarily, because you can have in general, I understand what you're saying, but not necessarily, because you can have a pool of applicants who the differences between their ability to do the work actually isn't that different. And if you're going to discriminate against a white qualified person and a black qualified person, let's say that their qualifications are exactly the same by whatever metric you want to use, right? But you choose the white person because they're white. That's still a form of discrimination, consistent with the fact that you're still out of your pool of talent, you're still getting the same quality of worker.
And how would we? I just want to know what kind of talent pool are we talking about here? Because if you're competing with other businesses, I don't think there is such a thing as such an ample talent pool that you are able to just freely discriminate based on color without having to run into some issues. It's like if
What I'm saying
we're
is that
talking
it
about,
is definitely possible.
it's
It's definitely
possible, but
possible
it's
because a
it's
lot of the
possible, but I don't
talent pools for
think
a lot of
that's
different forms of employment are wide. Some of them are the more specialized you get, then the pool is shortened for sure,
yeah,
right? But then what usually
like
happens
education, for
systemically is
example.
that the people who are eligible, but the people who are eligible at the higher levels, because of a whole bunch of systemic factors, tend to be less and less likely to be non-white, and there's a whole bunch of systemic reasons for that. And so like it's
Wait, I'm
it's more
sorry. Can you
complicated
repeat
than
that?
just having two candidates. Because of a whole bunch of systemic factors, there are going to be sectors of our economy or whatever
Mm-hmm.
where people are searching for talent, and the more specialized they get, right, there are less and less Black people to even have the opportunity, right? So one example of this would be head coaches in the NFL, right? Just one off the top of my head, right? It's not that we don't have a whole bunch of Black people who could be head coaches in the NFL, but like when you start getting to the upper echelon, because of a whole bunch of systemic factors, there's less and less Black people at that level to even be candidates for that position for various different systemic reasons, right? And so it makes the whole discussion more complicated because it's not just a matter of, oh, I have a white candidate and I have a Black candidate, and the discrimination takes the form of choose the white one over the Black one because racism, right? It's a lot of it is like built into like whether or not Black people can even be a part of the pool in the first place, because you have to jump through all the hoops, you have to get through all the credentials, you have to get through all the experience, etc. Right? Like that's part of the landscape of the kinds of systemic forms of discrimination or oppression or racism that a lot of people have in mind. Now, to bring it back to gender, though, because we've been talking for almost a whole hour and haven't really touched the documentary. What all I'm trying to do is analogize like the what people have in mind in terms of this discourse are those kinds of factors that negatively implicate trans and non-binary people in virtue of the fact that they are admitting of gender identities that are non-standard and that in some sense deviate from what they call the gender binary, and they view it as oppressive inherently in virtue of these tensions that I'm trying to describe. And they're not simple. They're actually very multifaceted and complex because of the nature of how our society is organized. The organizational structure of our society is itself nuanced and complex. It's extremely complex, right? Which is why I objected to your centralization thing, because it to me felt like you were oversimplifying how our society is organized. But
no,
and it looks like we're gonna have to do a part 2 because you got to go soon. But I do want to ask you some very specific things about the documentary. What can you and you can respond to me and then answer this question. Can you pinpoint something in the documentary that stood out maybe the most to you in terms of some of the issues that you or bones you have to pick with this discourse on gender?
Yeah, there were two. There were, 2 or 3 interviews in there that sort of struck me as extremely strange. One of them being I forgot. I believe she was a gender affirming. What's it called? Pediatrician. The one with the green hair.
My name is Michelle Forcier, and I have a medical degree from University of Connecticut, residency, University of Utah Pediatrics, and I've worked for a number of different Planned Parenthoods for 20 years. I do advanced contraception and abortion, as well as gender hormones, and sort of looking at the whole sort of schema of gender, sex, and reproductive justice.
So you've done.
So that was probably one of the more disturbing interviews within the actual documentary, and this was because of her outright refusal to acknowledge any sort of biological reality as far as sex and how it typically expresses. Well, not typically, really, almost in almost every case. Has a certain set of biological criteria that go along with the delineation between man and woman. Specifically, when Matt Walsh asked her, would it be wrong to assume that a chicken is female if I saw it lay eggs?
If I see a chicken laying eggs and I say that's a female chicken laying eggs, did I assign female, or am I just observing a physical reality that's happening in the world?
Does a chicken have gender identity? Does a chicken cry?
Well,
Does a chicken commit suicide? Let's
What does that have to do
frame
with-
it, because you're trying
A chicken has sex like any biological
chicken has
organism.
an assigned gender, but a chicken doesn't have a gender identity.
So we assign female to chickens when they lay eggs?
We assume they're female if they lay eggs.
And her immediate deflection was, hey, do chickens have feelings? Do chickens cry? Do chickens have depression? Or do they try to commit suicide? Which I thought was, it's such a simple question. And I think the reason why he asked it was so that he'd be able to point out to a quite frankly, a ridiculous answer in order to avoid making the concession that, okay, yeah, well, there are certain things that we can use as actual markers to define whether someone is a male or female. I think that speaks to the confusion that's happening now between like gender and sex, whereas before we were able to say like, all right, well, there's sex and then there's gender, and now I'm seeing it happen very slowly. Maybe it's just me. I don't think it is, but the definitions of those two are starting to bleed into each other, and they're starting to just become interchangeable. And I think that's a huge problem, especially with someone who's actually treating children and has to make actual decisions whether or not she would administer drugs like Lupron.
One of the drugs used is Lupron, right? Which has actually been used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
You know what? I'm not sure that we should continue with this interview because it seems like
Why
it's
is that?
going in a particular direction.
Well, you're a medical professional,
I am a medical professional.
so you don't want to talk about the drugs that you give to kids, or?
Again, I'm a physician and I use medication. You're choosing exploitive words. Drugs I give to kids.
I'm choosing a
chemical
word that was
castration.
in a dictionary.
That's not a correct term for puberty blocking.
I
in
mean,
a
I could look it
transgender
up on my
person.
phone, but I'm pretty sure if I looked it up,
You can look it up on your phone.
it says medical definition, the administration of a drug to bring about a marked reduction in the body's production of androgens and especially testosterone.
And I'm saying, as a pediatrician who takes care of hundreds of these kids, when you use that terminology, you are being malignant and harmful.
I mean, there are some who would say that giving chemical castration drugs to kids is malignant and harmful.
It's about the context of caring for a child and seeing the suffering that kids can have that have not been in affirmative home situations.
Which she avoided completely the subject once it was brought up. And she makes claims about the reversibility of these procedures.
At what age does the medical transition begin with medication?
So medical affirmation begins when the patient says they're ready for it. So that could be a kiddo who is just starting puberty and panicking because they're getting breast buds or their penis is getting bigger and busier and they're worried about all kinds of masculine changes. And that way, puberty blockers, which are completely reversible and don't have permanent effects, are wonderful because we can put that pause on puberty. Just like if you were listening to music, you put the pause on and we stop the blockers and puberty would go right back to where it was. The next note in the song just delayed that period of time.
I think that's a very dangerous thing, for children. I think if you're an adult, you should be able to do it. You own your own body, and if you think this will help you, and if you make a mistake, that's on you. If you don't make a mistake, I'm glad for you. But the fact that this is the person that's making decisions for children, I think is quite worrisome.
Fair. I mean, I feel you. I felt the tension that you felt too. And you know me, I gotta try my best to steel man things.
Of course.
I will say that I do think it is more complicated. There are some complexities that we need to take into account. One is, from my limited understanding as a non-expert, if you allow a person to mature into adulthood, and there's no, let's call them medically safe interventions done with respect to that natural process of development into a mature, let's say you're a what's the term? The sex assigned at birth. I know you're annoyed by this, but try to accommodate the discourse. The sex assigned at birth of the person in question was male, and this person experiences gender dysphoria and identifies as a woman. If you allow the process of maturation all the way until they're 18 without any kind of intervention, puberty blockers, anything like that, then they're gonna reach a point in their maturation where the processes that are necessary, the interventions that are necessary at that point, are going to be way more intrusive. And so they're going to require more surgeries and things like that. So that's an example of something that's more intrusive. But if you give them puberty blockers and things like that and delay those things or stop those things in the first place, then there's less intrusive things that they would have to undergo in order to be able to have their body, insofar as they want to at 18, conform to the identity, their gender identity, their preferred gender identity, or the gender identity that they feel that they are, whatever the most accurate way to describe that, consistent with people who sincerely hold these views, is. And so that is a kind of complex thing. So part of the controversy is whether you even buy the initial premises in the first place. And I don't think that you do. But what I'm trying to articulate is that actually is a position that I've heard people on this side articulate. And so one of the reasons why they're really, really interested in having teenagers in being introduced to puberty blockers and things like that in the first place is for that reason. There are practical considerations in terms of that. And what they do, because the surgeries are themselves riskier than a lot of these other things as well. So a lot of these people, not every one of them, I would argue, but a lot of these people are actually operating in good faith. They may be mistaken, but they're operating in good faith because what they're trying to do is they're trying to maximize the ability of a person who genuinely experiences gender dysphoria and genuinely wants to transition eventually, maximize the ability to do that in the least intrusive way and the least medically risky way.
Yeah, I think that last part, especially the medically risky way, I think that is something that's being thrown by the wayside. I don't think there's enough evidence
in all cases or some cases.
In most cases, if you're administrating, these, quite frankly, experimental procedures on children, in which we don't really quite understand what it will do to them in the long term. And as far as what we know so far, there is very little. There's actually a lot more evidence that it actually causes permanent damage. And we're seeing, for example, communities of tens of thousands of of people who've decided to reverse their gender assignment surgeries or their hormone therapy. There aren't that many trans people. It's a very rare occurrence. So it's probably in like the hundreds of thousands.
How would you know they're not coming out and identifying because of the persecution they fear they might?
Well, that's the thing. It's like we have the society that has probably the most acceptance, as far as we know, of transgender people anywhere on the planet. Perhaps the only one rivaling it would be Thailand.
What Is a Woman documentary is the most accepting of trans people?
Of the gender ideology, absolutely. It's like this one.
The same society that is banning trans people in sports is the same society that is the most accepting of trans people?
I mean, in New York, it's illegal to misgender someone as an institution. And so it is.
That's true.
So is
That's
it
true.
in
That's true.
Canada.
There are pockets of our society, but what I'm trying to get you to do is be careful about the overgeneralization, because there are pockets of our society that are antithetical to it as well. And so if you're going to make the general claim that this is the most trans inclusive society, it's like,
yeah, but that's also relative, because if we're talking about pockets in other societies, those pockets are not.
No. I'm talking about no. Let me clarify. With respect to the United States specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of places where it's like being trans and non-binary. You're going to be very supported because the political milieu and the cultural milieu surrounding that places like New York, places like here in San Francisco where I live, are conducive to it, because a lot of people recognize the value of the support, because it minimizes in their minds, and I think this is probably generally true, it minimizes the likelihood that people will be driven to suicide or will endure all of the kinds of forms of persecution they otherwise would endure from people who don't understand. But there are other pockets of our society, stereotypically places like in the South, deep red states, the countryside, Bible Belt, etc., where not so much. That's not going to be accepted. And so you're liable to be ridiculed and get all the forms of persecution that are associated with being trans and non-binary, being regarded as weird, being discriminated against, being ostracized socially, etc., if you're trans or non-binary. And so to say that the whole society of the United States as a whole is the most inclusive of trans people is not quite accurate, or like not properly attentive to the nuance I'm trying to describe, if that makes sense.
Well, if we're comparing the overall sentiment here to other societies across the world, even if it is in certain pockets, even if it is not necessarily uniform in this country, the overall sentiment, if you were to sort of quantify it, would be much higher than almost anywhere else on the planet. And I think we can both agree on that. And that was like in relation to other places.
I mean, maybe it depends on it would depend on the places you're comparing it to, but I think I understand what you're saying better enough to agree with the general sentiment you're saying. I'll partially agree. But I'm just attentive to that nuance. But okay, so go ahead. I wanted you to finish your thought.
Yeah. So my point is to see that there are people who regret these sorts of decisions, and to see that there are actual consequences that would completely bar someone. For example, a young girl would breast removed, and her her what's it called her gonads like affected by chemical castration, or drugs like Lupron, which impede the full development of her sexual. This is something that I think a person who's not able to legally get a tattoo because it's deemed as something that is a permanent change that you may not have the mental faculty to undertake quite yet. I think that's a very dangerous combination, and I think it actually, in my opinion, it violates the Hippocratic Oath of doing no harm, because I don't think you know enough to know whether or not this is harm. Like, you cannot give me the argument and prove that you are not harming this person, and I think that by itself is a violation of that oath.
I think an argument can be given. I don't know that you'll find it convincing, and so this may fall by the wayside. But there's a couple of things I want to point out. There's something about the comparison that is not, in terms of, and again, this is filtered through the limitations of my understanding. In terms of what I think people are trying to convey about the importance of doing this stuff, transitioning people, putting young children on puberty blockers, etc. There's a little bit of a disanalogy if you're going to compare it to getting a tattoo, because the purpose of getting a tattoo in some sense is a kind of adornment on one's body. It isn't really about one's identity. It isn't really about one's conception of themselves, or at least not essentially. It can in some sense be a part of your identity insofar as the significance of whatever the tattoo is symbolizes a facet of your personality or something like that. I don't know that people identify with their tattoos in the way that they identify as a man or a woman. And so that part of the analogy is a little bit uneven. And so it makes the comparison a little strained. But the part that the point that you're making, I do want to recognize the validity of it. I do understand what you're saying in terms of like the logic of the permanence of the change being done. And there is an irreducible inability to predict whether or not this person will regret this permanent change or want to change their minds later. And we do have a whole bunch of cases of people who quote unquote detransition. And so this makes this decision a really high stakes decision. And I think your contention, and a lot of the contention of people who agree with you, is that if we, as a matter of medical practice, are allowing minors to make permanent decisions with respect to their body that they may change their mind about or come to regret later, and we're in some sense encouraging this because the latest and greatest of medical science says it's a good thing when it may not necessarily be. And actually a lot of medical research is being done to suggest that it actually might not be the best option for children that young. Then we need to think twice about it. I think that's the point you're making, and I recognize the validity of it. However, there are cases where people actually do end up going on to not regret it, and they end up kind of, so to speak, living the rest of their lives to the best of their abilities, like anybody else. I wouldn't say they live happily ever after, live perfect lives, because nobody does. But there are success stories, and the success stories are being ignored or downplayed by a lot of people who are emphasizing the risks involved. So there's that. But two, if you're going to have a success story, then you would want to start earlier rather than later. And I know that the cutoff point for making decisions like this is adulthood at 18, but that doesn't coincide with the natural physical development of puberty, etc. right? Puberty starts before 18. So that's one of the reasons why I think people are trying to advocate that this happens younger, even though there's a tension that we have in our society between two sets of norms. One set of norms is these kinds of decisions are left to legal adults at 18, but they're trying to take into account the kind of medical biological factor of puberty, which starts as young as 10 years old, right? And so how do you weigh all of that? I'm not pretending to have all the answers, but what I am trying to do is give us a better appreciation for all of the nuances involved, so to make this a little bit more of a all-encompassing kind of thing, because I think that a lot of people will come away from this documentary thinking that there is no possible justification for doing anything to children that young. And I'm trying to establish that actually there are medically necessitated rational grounds for looking to do this. But I do hear your point about whether or not these rational medical grounds are being weighed properly against the high stakes nature of the decision. And that's kind of me being a moderate, kind of me splitting the difference.
No, I appreciate that. And, I think even beyond the detransitioning or changing your mind consequences, there are physical, consequences like early onset cancer or infections.
Osteoporosis is another potential drawback of taking particular forms of puberty blockers if you take too much. And there's actually been a case of somebody who got osteoporosis really bad.
She was very young too.
Right. So there are, but the reason, so we need to have this discussion like this in a mature way that is in some sense tracking the facts to the best of our ability. And there may be some things that I fudged because I'm not an expert. I tried to lead with that, but we can't be taboo to question the decision to transition kids, and we can't be being slandered as transphobic for asking serious, good faith questions about whether or not this is a good idea in terms of standard medical practice. On the other hand, though, those who typically lean right-centered need to be able to have these, be able to engage in good faith with some of the considerations about, the nature of identity itself, which is actually really hard to talk about in ways that deviate from a lot of the preconceived notions that we have and expectations that we have surrounding men and women. Like people are very deeply uncomfortable with that because it interferes with their conception of themselves. It interferes with what they've learned to expect from their children. And a lot of people are being protective of their children, understandably so, but from different political starting points and different philosophical starting points. Some people want to protect their children in the sense of, I want to be able to make sure that my child's trans identity is affirmed as early as possible so that they don't have to go through all of the negative outcomes of not having it affirmed. They're protective in that sense, and they're pro-transitioning. Then you have people who want to be protective of, I don't want my child to be indoctrinated with this weird ideology and being tricked into thinking that there's something that they're not, and then being encouraged to undergo a whole bunch of permanent surgeries and transitionary things and puberty blockers and things like that because they're confused, right? And so I'm being protective of that. So everybody's being protective, but they're starting from different philosophical starting points, and we're talking past each other because we're not really trying to account for what the other side is saying. I've talked too much. I want to let you have the last word, and then we'll get you out of here.
Sure. I think I think there's an invasion of the whole conversation with gender theory and queer theory that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the medical legitimacy of what is actually an aesthetic medical intervention. You think that it's very unlike tattoos, but tattoos are aesthetic changes, permanent changes to your body, just as hormone treatment or surgery to change the appearance of your body or your sexual organs. That is an aesthetic change. It doesn't actually change the essence of your genetic makeup. It doesn't change the way you think about yourself necessarily as much as it is. It's essentially like affirmation through visual confirmation for yourself, if that makes any sense.
I mean, partially, but I think it
doesn't
comes
change
really close. No, I understand what you're saying, but it comes really close to downplaying the importance that it has to one's psychology and in one sense of comfortability in their own body, and that's
but we have to prove that.
The ultimate goal of it. 1, 2, it's not it's not obvious how that's any more different than doing corrective surgery for a person with a cleft palate, right? You can say it's an aesthetic change, but that doesn't change the fact that it actually is going to it doesn't change the fact that it actually has a very well documented relationship with a person feeling more comfortable in their own body, and has all kinds of implications for how they're going to be perceived socially, right? Because if you have an obvious deformity like that, if I can call it that without being too politically incorrect, right? Like, that's going to have all kinds of implications for your self-esteem. That's going to have all kinds of implications for how you feel about yourself. That's going to have all kinds of implications for how other people perceive you. And there's a lot of those dynamics and dimensions going on with people who transition as well. It's not it is aesthetic, but it's not merely aesthetic because of the nuanced relationship that it has with a person's self-confidence and how they're going to be perceived socially, which interacts in complex ways.
And the cleft palate example, that's if you long enough to actually even decide that you can get a surgery for it. The cleft palate surgeries are usually done on children and infants because
why
they're unable to suckle on they usually die from malnutrition.
That's part of it, but that's not the only reason why. But also, you have an operation on very young children who can't make the decision for themselves, right?
Yeah, but this is a life-saving intervention.
But that's exactly
a functional
how these
change.
people. I know you disagree. I know you disagree with it, but let me just make this point real quick.
We're not talking about the infant's self-perception.
Okay, I understand that, but no, but it's gonna. You're right. The infant doesn't have the self-perception when they're first born. You're right about that. But they're going to have a self-perception later, and we know that. Because we know how development works, and right. You're right. But what my point is this is exactly, and you may disagree with it for various different reasons, but this is exactly how the people who are promoting this feel that gender affirmation care, as they call it, is. They think it plays an analogous role in the life of the trans or non-binary person as the corrective surgery for cleft palate has in the life of the relevant infant in question. That's how they think of it fundamentally.
But they
would
have
wrong,
to demonstrate.
That's how they think of it.
Okay, that may be how they think of it, but I think there's a very easy logical test we can apply to this. Do people commit suicide less or more after surgery?
For trans people, or just in general?
For trans people.
The statistics that I saw said that the rate of suicidality goes up after surgery.
So then, how can we possibly make the claim that the actual affirmation of that person's self-perception would be beneficial to them? Like objectively beneficial.
What makes it hard is it's not clear if the reason why it goes up is because they got surgery or it's because of a confluence of other factors. You would have to know that information in order to complete the argument that you're implying. But at this point, you could say that it's possible that the one of the biggest intended outcomes of the surgery fails in a statistically significant number of cases, and that's why the rate of suicidality goes up. That is a possible explanation, not a confirmed one. And if that is true, then it would underscore the point you're making, for sure. But there are other possible explanations that have more to do with the fact that a lot of trans and non-binary people post-surgery are still facing various forms of persecution and discrimination despite the body transformations, and that is negatively impacting their psychology because they've already done the permanent thing and still haven't changed. It still hasn't fundamentally changed because it's not just about their affirmation. That's not the only reason why people undergo transition. There is a component about how they're going to be received socially as well, right? And so that is interacting, and that's why I tried to bring that up with the analogy. I know you got to go soon, so I'm gonna let you have the last word. I promise this time.
Yeah, sweet. Just to wrap it up real quick. One, as far as I don't think that the necessary lack of concrete causation of that suicidality rate is necessarily detracting from my point, as much as it is complete evidence that the burden of proof has not been met in their claim. They're the ones making the propositional claim that this gender affirming surgery is objectively beneficial. The fact that we cannot answer those questions, especially the question that I asked, is, I mean, if we're using logical principles, the burden of proof lies on the person making the claim. I'm not the one making the claim; they are, and I think that's an obvious gaping hole in it. And two, even if you are, if you do end up looking like a woman and having a sexual organ similar to a woman, the vast majority of men are heterosexual. If they're going to be choosing partners, it doesn't matter if you look the part. I mean, and there are also women that look the part far better than other women, let alone men who've transitioned into being women. So either way, that discrimination, which is completely justifiable, if you don't want to sleep with someone or have children with someone, or look at a person a certain way, you are not obliged to do so just because they want you to. It's like you're not only competing against women. It's like, which most people aren't attractive. Like, most people are of average attractiveness. It's like there are
you might be
people who are.
shocked.
I might be shocked to what?
To know this. You might be shocked to
What?
know this, but there are a lot of men who are attracted to trans women.
There are a lot
who have male anatomy.
If we're defining a lot by more than 5, yes, there are a lot. But if we're talking about
no, I mean, no,
their proportion
I think the amount of men who who are attracted to that, I think would shock you. To be clear,
I mean, if it's in the double digits,
bro,
I've
had discussions. I've also looked at the data. But Deborah So, actually, who opposes a lot of the things, who's kind of on your side on a lot of this, actually points this out too, because she's a sexologist, she's a sex researcher, and former academic sex researcher. But the data is clear on this. That there are actually men, and they consider themselves straight, which is a whole another fun conversation. Because what they're attracted to is the most effeminized version of a biological male possible. And so it's the feminine energy that they're going for, even though this person is male. It's the fact that they present as female that they are attracted to, at least partially. That's interesting. That's fascinating.
Do you happen to remember what like the statistical breakdown is for that?
No, and I'm going to find it for our
okay.
part 2, because we're going to end up doing a part 2 because you got to go.
Yeah, I have to go.
So, Ibrahima, thank you. Did you want to give another closeout in another language, like you gave your opening?
Well, as always, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Hello to all my Muslims out there, and even the non-Muslims. You're all part of the Ummah. But this was fun. I'm looking forward to part 2. And
we're gonna actually talk about the
documentary. Yeah, I was gonna say, let's actually talk about the documentary next time.
We got to talk about race. I'm like, bro, what are we talking about race? It's not a race episode, bro. It's not a race episode.
Bro,
we're gonna have part 2, I guess.
Yeah, man.
All right. Well, as always, thank you, and until part 2, is it assalamu alaikum? Is that it?
Yes, sir.
All right. I see. I'm learning. This was done. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was part 1 of the Black Muse Podcast episode on What is a Woman. We didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of the documentary, but we will soon. My friend Ibrahima, my guest, he had to go, but we'll get into part 2, and we'll do a 3 and a 4 if we have to. We're gonna get into it though, but I like the fact that this is going to be extended, and so that we can really dive into the nuances. So until next time, this has been the Black Muse Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Muse, and I will see you again for part 2. Until then, peace.